Thank you so much, and delighted to be here this afternoon with Avinash, with Salim, and with Kareem. And I think what we're here to do is bring to the surface something of the conversation that happened yesterday. And it's also a conversation that has continued into today, as we've heard through some of the other speakers over the course of the day, this question of rules and this question of money and how money flows through a system and the way in which currently the flows of finance are associated with so much of what we would identify as destroying both human lives and the ecosystem on which we depend. So the question that faces us is no less than, how do we transform the global financial architecture so that it cuts off the flows of finance to destructive activity and flows finance to where it is needed in a way that supports human and ecological flourishing. So I'm going to come to Avinash, first of all, who has some very clear thoughts. Avinash.
Thank you very much. I was really quite struck by the last presentation, and it reminded me, and it should remind all of you, that not easily, not before time, but things can change. Genocide defined, empires dismantled, apartheid falling. And in the same way, I think we can end the climate crisis. To do so means we need to tackle the fact that the climate crisis is incentivized to take place. Nothing that's happening is happening by accident, happening out of pure malice, although there may well be some. It is happening because it's incentivized to happen. If we want to change, we have to change those incentives. And the problem is not that people don't care as much as you care. The problem is not that they don't understand the science and you do. We must be very careful about taking on a slightly superior view that other people don't have the same views we do. The world is behaving the way it is because it's incentivized to happen. And I just talk a little bit about that imbalance and then about our proposal. So the countries that, we argue in the world that climate change will envelop us all, and it will. But it's not doing so today. Its impact is very differential. I'm afraid to say, those of you who live here, you're not experiencing climate change. I was born in Barbados in the Caribbean. When a hurricane hits us, these hurricanes are bigger than our islands. 200% of our GDP is destroyed in 4 hours. In the same year, we have droughts and flooding. When you had the worst storms in living memory in Germany and Belgium, 0.1% of GDP was destroyed. English wine production is up 5-fold in 10 years. Canada and Russia will benefit from climate change before they start suffering from climate change. That is why not enough is being done. The countries with the ability to do something are actually not feeling it. The countries who are feeling it are the countries who have no ability to do anything about it. The frontline countries, those lying between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. So we need a solution that allows us to break free for what in fact is a realization of climate injustice. So we in this room probably all recognize climate injustice. But climate injustice is actually an obstacle to why we're not doing anything, because we recognize the injustice. Those of us for whom injustice is being done recognize it and want a solution that addresses it. That solution is not available. Those who have perpetuated the injustice don't want it to be discussed. And so we're not making progress. We need a solution that appears to move beyond the finger pointing. So we need and we're arguing for three things. These three things are being presented at the IMF and the World Bank, at COP26, COP27, COP28. Already we are seeing doors opening and change happening. It requires building a grand coalition, and the coalition is based around three ideas. I promise to be very quick because we've got lots of interesting ideas to talk about and experiences to talk about here. The first one is that we need grants for loss and damage. There's no point coming and offering us loans when a country's lost 200% of GDP. They don't have the capacity to pay back. They need grants. Well, you know what? Grants are in short supply. And if we say to people, we need grants, the world needs grants, that's fine. It's easy to say, hard to do. So we need all of the grants available focused on the one thing that cannot be financed in any other way, and that's loss and damage. And we need to fund that loss and damage facility with a levy on consuming fossil fuels to make sure it has enough money to do so. We need to recognize climate adaptation. The world has been so slow in climate mitigation that we need adaptation and resilience. This costs hundreds of billions of dollars a year. The world has spent 20 years trying to come together with a $100 billion fund. We're talking about a $3–4 trillion problem. The scale is not there. We need concessional funding for those countries highly vulnerable to climate change so they can make themselves resilient and adaptable. And that can only be done by the state. There's no imagining that the private sector will swoop in and make countries resilient. There's no revenue streams for them. There's no magical technology that will solve this problem. This is money. This is concessional government-to-government money. And it has to be, the eligibility for that exists today. That money exists today. But climate-vulnerable countries are not eligible for it. Only the world's poorest countries are eligible for concessional funding. And you know what? 75% of the world's poor don't live in poor countries. And so we have to think, do we care about poor people or do we care about poor countries? We need to widen concessional money available for climate vulnerable countries. And the final thing we need to do in talking about changing this international financial architecture, it is being based around the idea, and the fundamental flaw of Paris is based around countries, individual countries. It's not going to work based around individual countries. Individual countries will fight about who's doing more, who's doing less, who should be doing more. So we need an international balance sheet, a global balance sheet, to come up and fund global solutions to the global problem. We believe that balance sheet should be funded by an issuance of special drawing rights. It's already been issued. There are $1 trillion of these. They're being kept for a rainy day, and we're saying this is that rainy day. Channel those SDRs into a global trust that will facilitate, incentivize the funding of the energy transition, the transport transition, the agriculture transition. We need $3 or $4 trillion a year spent on these things, but if we spent $500 billion, $500 billion on creating the incentives, we'll be able to mobilize private savings, the savings of everyone, towards these transitions. Those are the three things we need to do. A loss and damage facility funded by a levy on consuming fossil fuels. We need climate adaptation, concessional funding for adaptation, and we need a global balance sheet. And let me end with this one point. You know, climate justice, we need to think about climate justice in what we do. Many of the solutions being proposed by the North and by our liberal friends and allies in the North are actually not about climate justice. If you end fossil fuel production today, there will be huge redistributional impact, and the poorest countries will suffer the most. You can't do that. You have to tell us where's the funding for it. If you say, end fossil fuel production today, and here's the money for the transition, that's a totally different idea. Paris is fundamentally flawed because its missing ingredient is finance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to pick up with Salim as someone who has been present at every single United Nations climate conference since the first conference was held in 1995 in Berlin, to give us your perspective on climate justice in the context of those distributional questions that Avinash has just raised.
Great. Thank you very much, Ruth, and good afternoon. And let me also start by saying today happens to be Eid al-Adha, which is the Muslim festival And so I wish everybody Eid Mubarak, which is Happy Eid. So picking up from what Avinash just mentioned and referring to the annual Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention, that really is the only place where the vulnerable countries have a seat at the table and a voice. Not that their voice is listened to very much, but it is the only place where they are listened to. The G7 doesn't include them. The G20 that's meeting in Indonesia in the next couple of days doesn't include them. The UN Framework Convention is the only place where the poor countries are able to participate and get together and lobby and advocate for their positions. So that's why I've been going to them, to help the poor countries to do that more effectively. But the question of climate justice doesn't really arise in the UN Framework Convention. It's just seen as something that everybody's going to do because of the goodness of their hearts and not acknowledge that it is actually a polluting problem. It's not a development problem, it's a pollution problem. And there are some polluters and there are victims of pollution. And they're all sitting around the table. And the victims are asking for compensation for loss and damage, and the polluters are saying no. And it's very, very difficult to get consensus in those circumstances. So to me, picking up on what Avinash said, the notion of climate justice, which is picking up outside the UNFCCC, and this gathering is a good example, needs to be refined a little bit. And my personal feeling is I'm not really particularly attracted to the term climate justice because it sounds more like an ideal. I prefer to use the terms climate injustice because the injustice is absolutely visible. It's rich people causing a problem, poor people suffering because of that problem. Rich people in all countries, including in my country, Bangladesh, but mostly in the rich countries, and poor people in all countries, even including in the rich countries, but primarily in the poorer countries. And so that is a manifest injustice. It's immoral, it's wrong, and something everybody can relate to and acknowledge that it's wrong, it shouldn't happen. And if you happen to be a person whose carbon footprint is above the normal or average of the world, then you are part of the problem. I am part of the problem. My carbon footprint is bigger than the average Bangladeshi by many times. And so I need to take responsibility. Each of us need to take responsibility and to find out ways in which we can manifest that responsibility. Not everybody has to do the same thing, but we all need to accept responsibility and figure out ways in which we can contribute. And the principle that I would like to put forward for making that contribution is a sense of solidarity, global solidarity. For those of us who are polluters, with the victims of pollution. Find ways to connect with them, help them, support them, advocate for them, and that to me would be a way to address climate justice or climate injustice.
Thank you, Salim. Thank you so much. Karim, if I could come to you and picking up both from the previous conversation in which Philippe emphasised the importance of words and the ways in which words matter. I wonder if you could say something about both those terms, climate justice and injustice, and also why the way that we talk about the climate crisis and the nature crisis and the human crisis matter.
Absolutely. As an Open Society Foundation, very much this event and the themes that Avi and Salim have mentioned is really at the root of the work that we do and the things we like to fund, this sort of interconnectedness. So we have got artists here, we've got activists here, we've got people walking off of the park, we've got policy wonks, finance policy wonks and Brussels policy wonks like me, all coming together, talking about what we understand about these words, right? And this is exactly the type of intersection, interconnectedness that we like to fund and promote. And why is it important? It's important because we are all interconnected. Salim, says it all the time, the solidarity. Where is the world solidarity around climate injustice? And we have entered the field as a foundation who has funded human rights and transparency issues and helping ethnic minorities for many decades, have come into this climate space. And what do we want to do? We want to exactly bring out this idea that it's justice, but there's an injustice that has happened. And you can't have justice if you do not recognize the injustice. And Avi is very right, and I'm also from the Caribbean. There are sectors of the world who are feeling climate negatively. We are in London now, the weather is amazing. We love it. But of course, this is rare, lovely, but there are parts of the world where even, 0.0 degrees of heat means destruction, not enjoyment. And it's a recognition that while we are enjoying this and can appreciate that this weather is lovely and unique, there are some parts of the world that are suffering. And what is our role to play? And I think Avi mentioning apartheid and how that came to an end is a really good example, and also what this event is all about. What we hope to do is empower people again. This sense of powerlessness, that something is happening that we cannot control, that we cannot solve this problem that we have created, is wrong. We have it within our hands, within our consumerist policies, and within our commercial policies, within our arts, within our schools, within our lives, to right the injustice. And that's, if we communicate across sectors, if we communicate across experience and skills, we can get where we need to get to.
Wonderful and hopeful and practical. Thank you. Coming back to that task, I think for many of us, we were talking about this a moment ago, the global financial architecture is not something that any of us see, and yet it has rules and it has structures, but we don't see the flows of finance. And I was thinking that in relation to pollution, that we don't see, and there are questions there about how we make the invisible visible in order that they can be acted upon. So in terms of finance and an architecture through which it travels, how might we work together to make the invisible visible in a way that there is a role for everyone in acting on it?
I think the first thing to say is the idea that finance is invisible or it's hard to feel, it's intangible, there's this thing in cyberspace that we can't control, it is a deliberate narrative to make us feel we can't do something about it. And I say that with confidence because I used to believe in it myself. I first met a man called David Hillman, who was leading Stamp Out Poverty, when we were both on the opposite sides of a Radio 4 interview on taxing currency transactions. And David was proposing this to help fund development and other things. And I was saying, it's a wonderful idea, David, but just can't be done. It's invisible, it's intangible, it's in cyberspace. And then I became director of a bank, and I had to sign something saying I knew exactly what all the customers are doing with their money, because otherwise it'll be anti-money laundering. It's part of the anti-money laundering. And suddenly I realized we do know what they're up to. We do know what they're up to, and we can trace it. So I think the first thing to say is feel empowered. The things are the way they are because policy incentivizes it to happen. There's no natural basis. And I think that what we need, I've been very conscious the last couple of days with this great event that's been put on, where we're really bringing some of these abstract finance things with much more real cultural and creative ideas about how the impersonal is also personal. So solidarity, a sense of guilt for some people are good things, but we need, in addition to that, we need a pathway. It's like in a relationship. You may feel that you need to do something. You also need a pathway to make something better. And the pathway is we need to, if we want the countries that produce the most stock of greenhouse gases, talking about emissions of greenhouse gases is part of the climate injustice. Global warming is not caused by emissions of greenhouse gases. It's caused by the stock of greenhouse gases. And just 8 countries contributed 50% of the stock of greenhouse gases. And those 8 countries are pointing at newly developing countries and saying, you should stop doing what you're doing, even though the wealth of the world today is based entirely, correlated, dramatically defined, based on who contributed the most. So we need these countries, though, to be part of the solution. They can't believe that they are being chastised and ashamed and then there's nothing for them to do. We need to give them a pathway. So we want to create a global balance sheet where their companies and their countries could access money which they would incentivize them to mitigate the climate. Everyone should be able to access this money, but their companies and their countries can as well, so they feel part of the solution as well as being a major part of the cause of the problem. There needs to be a pathway in which you build a coalition in which they're part of the solution.
Thank you very much. And on that hopeful note, and a sense that things can be changed, Salim, coming back to you as someone who has been involved and followed these processes for a number of years and clearly hasn't given up hope because you're still doing it. What is it that keeps you going and what gives you hope?
Well, I guess, we've mentioned the fact that I've been to every single Conference of Parties over the last 30 years, but it's only 2 weeks in the year when I go there and I put on my suit and I go and act as a negotiator. The other 50 weeks, I'm at home in Bangladesh, where I'm a professor in a university and I have a research center, and I have hundreds of young people, the brightest and the best. That's what gives me hope. They are fighting about climate change. They're learning about climate change. They are acting about climate change. In fact, yesterday, there's a very active global movement of school kids called Fridays for Future. They come out every Friday. Yesterday, Friday, there were hundreds of demonstrations all over Bangladesh, school kids coming out and demonstrating. They're learning about climate change. They're learning about how to tackle climate change on the ground, adapt to the impacts of climate change, as Avinash says. And to me, this global movement of young people is really where the action is, where the future lies, and where my interest lies in working with. The leaders I've given up on, but I still go there to keep on fighting, but I don't expect much from them.
Thank you so much. And Kareem, what gives you hope?
Very similar to Salim, I've got kids. And my kids are mixed race. One parent from Germany, one parent from Trinidad. Ideas flow constantly in a very multi-ethnic, multicultural environment. They get it, I have to say. Mm-hmm. And I think very much I work with youth groups as well, like Salim. Yeah, people under 16, they all get it. They are not the problem. And of course, the reality is they will have to inherit the problem and also probably, figuring out the solutions. And all we are trying to do now is develop the tools, balance the balance sheet a little bit, and find a pathway for them so that it makes it easier. But we know, and when we speak with them and they understand inequality, they understand the climate crisis, they understand who's to blame, they understand that they need to do it together. They understand where they are situated and where others are and the gap. They get it. So it's, I have been working on climate change. Salim is a bit, my mentor for 20 years now. And you can lose hope for sure. But we keep living, right? So every day you get up and you do something. And they get it. And it's the optimism is there. I worry not.
Wonderful. So we need a plan. We need solidarity. And we need to learn from the way that young people are in the world. So if I may, I'm going to finish with a quote from the Uruguayan novelist and journalist Eduardo Galeano, who at the end of Upside Down, which is his educational manifesto for a looking-glass world, he says this. He says, living wherever, living however, living whenever, Each person contains many possible persons. Every day, the ruling system places our worst characteristics at centre stage, condemning our best to languish behind the backdrop. But the system of power is not in the least eternal. We may be badly made, but we're not finished. And it is the adventure of changing reality and changing ourselves that makes our blip in the history of the universe worthwhile. This fleeting warmth between two glaciers that is us. And with that, I would like to thank Avinash, Salim, and Kareem for a dose of practical hope today. Thank you.